name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Christ is among us. Please have a seat. God bless you. Thank you for coming out on this snowy day. On a snowy day like this, you might be thinking, wow, I wish I was somewhere warm and sunny. Hopefully not, because in Virginia we don't get snow enough to get that feeling. You know, this is still kind of fun. But I grew up in Michigan, where, like, when I got in the car today and drove here and I saw the skies, I was having flashbacks of growing up in Michigan winters, in which that could be the weather for a whole month straight. So I remember what it's like to look for sunny times and sunny places and to escape from this kind of weather. But right now I'm enjoying nostalgia. And last summer, after 6 months or so of fear and trepidation and lockdown, right? My wife and my daughter and I decided to take a little escape of ourselves, and we went to Ocean City because we said we need to be by the water. We need to get away from the city, all this craziness, and just sit by the water and hear the waves, smell that air. You know, there's something really just powerfully healing about being by a body of water. It doesn't even have to be an ocean. It could be a lake. Even it could be a stream. The sound of running water is beautiful too. So many times we've just gone up by a river in Michigan for vacation. It just does something. Yeah, I think studies have shown that it really does aid in convalescence and recovery, lowers blood pressure, all that kind of stuff. So coming by bodies of water is very much part of our healing. And of course, we're creatures of water, being 75% water. We're born in a womb filled with water, and we're reborn in a font of water, the font of baptism. So the Lord really is doing. We're creatures of water. But when I was at Ocean City, if you've ever been there, you know that there's this thing called the boardwalk. And the boardwalk takes all that is beautiful and wonderful about going to the beach and flushes it down the toilet. And corrupts it with all the cheapest and the weakest and most tawdry distractions civilization has ever had to offer. And not surprisingly, at one point on the boardwalk, kind of at the head of the boardwalk, if you will, or midway along it, there is a great big statue. Do you know who the statue is of? Neptune, Poseidon, the god of the sea. And it's as if to say, this is a place dedicated to a return to paganism. And if you walk down the boardwalk, you might see why. You might actually feel that that's quite true. And in the ancient world, paganism wasn't always in the eyes of people to be a bad. It's become a bad word, obviously, but in the ancient world, that was what it was. That was what you believed. And people would go to the sea for healing. And in the ancient world, there was two forms of medicine, basically. There was the ancient form of medicine, which was what you could scrabble from the earth, right? And then there was the spiritual medicine of the gods. They had, in ancient Greek religion, they had Asclepius, the god of medicine. And very often where there were shrines of Asclepius, there were bodies of water, there were pools, sacred pools, or like these places that you can go to in Europe and other places, the healing springs and so forth. And they were sacred places and dedicated to these gods. And in the Gospel of John, we see the story of a sheep pool, where the paralytic is laying there and hopes for the angel to come to stir the water. Now that was in a Hebrew context, but there were probably certain times in that place's history when it was occupied by pagans that it had been turned into an Asclepion, the temple of Asclepius. They recognized that as an example of what they would have done. There was another form of medicine, though, that developed, because that was only so good, right? Natural healing can only get you so far because you need to kind of sometimes know what to do to the body to make it heal itself. Sometimes it gets stuck. And so Hippocrates comes along. And
Hippocrates and then those who follow him in the school of Hippocratic medicine developed what could be called rational medicine, for what it's worth. They thought themselves following proto-science, basically, right? And so Hippocratic medicine is the first kind of example of secular science developing next to pagan religion healing ministry, if you will. And in the seaside area of Alexandria, Egypt, Alexandria became the center of learning of the ancient world. You know about the Library of Alexandria, and you weep over it if you're into that kind of history, that it was lost. But Alexandria was the hotbed of learning. And the whole Hippocratic corpus, the body of works attributed to the Hippocratic School of Medicine, really flourished and developed in Alexandria. And so there were doctors there. And they were in great demand because they were the most learned people about healing at the time. Now, at the same time, they had these seaside towns, because Alexandria is up by the Mediterranean. And there were temples to the healing gods of Egypt. They didn't have, maybe they had some Asclepian there from the Greeks who came, but there was also the temples of Isis and Serapis. And these were places where people would go for healing if they couldn't go to the doctor, or if the doctor failed them. So they had these two outlets for medicine. In the temples of Asclepian, one of their forms of treatment, which was rather interesting, was what was called incubation. And they would give you some type of concoction to put you into a deep sleep and a vivid sleep. And during that sleep, you would dream. And the god, if you were lucky, would come and give you oracular wisdom to tell you how to heal your sickness. And so that was one of the treatments that they offered, oracular visions. And apparently, for many people, it seemed to do the job because they were very popular. Come into the scene of ancient Alexandria, Christianity. Around the early 300s, you have Christians now who are living in the city, growing. It's a growing population in Alexandria and the suburbs, if you will, along the seaside towns. And among them is one of these Hippocratic doctors. His name he becomes a monk as well, and his name is Abba Kiros, or Cyrus. Abba Cyrus becomes what's known as an energiri, in a silverless doctor, an unmercenary healer, because he starts to treat people for free, pro bono. And in the ancient world, to be able to get a doctor, an actual Hippocratic doctor, to come to you and treat you was a luxury, right? Most people could not afford health care of that professional level. They were left to only being able to go to the gods, and the temples were places where people could go for free. That's one of the reasons they were so popular. Maybe they made a donation, but they weren't being charged, right? And all this environment comes this Abba Kiros, who is healing people as a doctor, but then also as a spiritual healer as well. He joins the two schools of medicine of the ancient world, spiritual and secular, into one ministry. And he has with him a disciple who joins him, whose name is John. So we remember today Cyrus and John, the unmercenary healers, these two trained physicians who worked their ministry of healing and spiritual healing. So when people could not be healed by the regular medicine that they had, they would pray over them in the name of the Lord and bring them healing. The persecutions of Diocletian come to the city of Alexandria, and they start arresting Christians wholesale. And there is a woman named Athanasius. She has 3 daughters, ages 15, 13, and 11, and they're arrested for being Christian. Can you imagine the terror of living in a society where you're a mother of 3 daughters and you're arrested for being a Christian, you imagine what kind of protections and rights you might have in that society? What danger you are about to be under? John and Ceres hear about this. I don't know if they knew them ahead of time, if they had been patients of theirs, but they were moved by this tragedy, and they went to the city of Alexandria to encourage them, to do what they could for them, to minister to them. And when the authorities heard that these 2 Christian doctors had come and were they were not trying to convince this woman and her daughters to apostatize. They were not trying to convince these women and young girls to accept paganism. And rather, they were encouraging them to be steadfast in their faith. They said, well, we got to do something about this. We can't let these guys do this. Well, they're doctors. We need doctors. It doesn't matter. They're standing against us and the authority of the governor and the emperor. And so they decide they're going to torture Ceres and John in front of the young women and the girls to see if they can terrorize them into betraying their faith. But instead, they are more encouraged because they see the fortitude of these 2 doctors willing to suffer for Christ. And in the end, they basically cut to the end. They realize it's going nowhere. They behead all of them. And that is why we commemorate them today. We commemorate these saints for their martyrdom. Terrible story. But that's not the end of the story. It never is. Because their lives continue to make a difference and go on. 100 years later, now it's 412 or so, Cyril of Alexandria, St. Cyril of Alexandria, ascends to the throne of the Patriarchy of Alexandria. Christianity has been legalized for almost 100 years. It's been in the ascendancy for 100 years. And now those pagan temples are kind of falling into they're backpedaling, right? They're not the powerhouses that they once were. And Cyril says, we've got the city in our hands, but the suburbs are still kind of under the sway of the pagan gods. Those seaside towns with their boardwalks and their, shenanigans. We need to do something. Go and build a church in Meneuthus. How many of you have been to Meneuthus? You can't, by the way, now I'll tell you why in a few minutes. Meneuthus was one of these seaside cities. And the name probably comes from a title for Isis, the goddess, Egyptian goddess, who's the mother of Horus. So it may mean mother of God, mother of Horus in the Coptic. Or that's the origin of the word. And there in Meneuthus was one of the last great temples of Isis, which was doing all this kind of Isis and Serapis, the god of medicine, doing these healing ministries. And people, even Christians, were tempted to go there. Some would go to sleep and have these oracular dreams and be deceived by the spirits that dwelt in those places. So they said, we need to do something. So Cyril builds a church literally across the street from the temple of Isis to the holy evangelists. And he says, we need to put somebody there to kind of build up the church. So he takes the relics of Ceres and John, the 2 doctors, the 2 unmercenary healers, and places their relics in the church of the evangelists in Meneuthus. And guess what? Stuff starts to happen. And miracles start to happen. And healings start to happen. And so basically the temple of Isis starting to slowly go out of business. Because the Christians have more powerful saints. They have more powerful healing power at their disposal than the prayers of these holy saints. In the name of Jesus Christ. But to the credit of the Christians, because Cyril is often given a bad rap because of the whole story of Hypatia, and kind of the pagan, the kind of counter-persecution against pagans that started to develop. They kind of peacefully coexisted across the street from each other. Kind of like those little mission churches you see in the middle of bad neighborhoods. And for about another 70 75 years, they coexist because they have a lot to learn from each other. Pagan learning is still the standard in the ancient world. Hippocratic learning, grammar, rhetoric, all those things are all being taught by pagans and Christians, and the learned people want to learn from the best of the best. So they'll learn from pagans as much as they will from Christians. So these things are tolerated and they continue for a long time. Until finally, 484, there's a story of a guy named Paralyus. He's kind of an obnoxious college student of the day. And Paralyus goes and he's studying at this temple of Isis, and he's trying to learn all these things. And he starts to hear these sketchy stories about like fake miracles. Like one family that had infertility shows up and prays and prays and prays, and they don't get a baby until they're told to go to a certain town, and there they will finally be able. Of course, they basically went, and a priestess of Isis gave them a child, or not wedlock, to adopt, and it was kind of a scandalous story, and they attributed it as a miracle, but it kind of came to light. It was scandalous. And he started to be having problems. And then he said, well, maybe I'll try one of these oracular dreams. And in the dream, he had a vision that the goddess told him, beware of this student, for he is a magician, and he has it out for you. He's like, oh, that's pretty serious. I better be careful. Then he finds out that student had a dream. Guess what that dream said? Beware of Paralyus. He's a magician, and he has it out for you. Apparently, it was a common thing. Paranoia and fear. So he finally said, this is ridiculous. I'm done with this. I'm leaving this behind. My brother has become a Christian. I'll try that. And so he's, like I said, he's kind of an obnoxious college student, no offense to college students around. And he starts bad-mouthing the priesthood of Isis, and they don't like that. They don't like to see one of their former students go bad-mouthing them, so they beat him up. And then the Christians hear that one of their kids got beat up, even though he kind of had come. And they get mad, and they come, and basically they end up tearing down that temple for good. It's not a pleasant story, not a flattering picture of Christianity in the 5th century, but it wasn't a particularly flattering time, honestly. It was a really ugly time with disputes and fights and a lot of bad feeling, as the church grappled with what it meant to be kind of the church in charge of the world, of civilization in its area at least. And the last great priest of the goddess Isis there, to kind of rub in the dirt, Horopolo, was tortured and forcibly converted to Christianity. So not really converted, but basically all the bad things that they had been doing to them 170 years prior, they were now doing it to the Christians. Nevertheless, the church, with the relics of St. John and Cyrus, becomes, in essence, the only game in town, and continues to be a powerful place of healing in spite of the bad behavior of the Christians for quite a while afterward. Such that about 150 years later, St. Sophronius of Jerusalem, interestingly, goes to pray there. He's suffering from blindness of some sort, and he has, guess what, a dream in which the saints show up and heal. One heals one eye, the other saint heals the other eye. So the full circle, the incubation healing rites of the ancient world become completely Christianized. St. Sophronius writes in gratitude the life of these saints and details 70 miracles that were attributed to these saints over the course of the last 150 years or so. And their relics eventually are sent off to Rome, and maybe for various reasons, where they stay for many years. And sadly, maybe because their relics were taken away, the gods of the sea apparently had their revenge, because shortly thereafter, a series of earthquakes came and sank Meneuthus under the sea. So you can go there, but you have to have scuba gear. And there are people who go through the ruins of that. Why am I telling you this crazy story? Because you might read the story of St. John and Cyrus, and that will, you'll get the one paragraph version, but you won't understand the whole reason why these saints are such important saints. They are really the emblematic transformation of antiquity to a Christian world, in which the reality of paganism is not completely extinguished, but is rather transformed and transfigured in the light of Christ through the work of the saints. The saints are now the gods of healing. Not literally, but they take the place in the mindset of the people. They go to them as their intercessors before the one true God, and they get their healing. Yet at the same time, it's important not to read the stories of the unmercenary healers as, see, you don't really need medicine, you just need prayer. That's what these guys are trying to show us. That's a mistaken reading of the lives of unmercenary saints. The unmercenary healers were real doctors who did real medicine. They never said, don't do medicine. But they said, do also spiritual care. Avoid sin. Because more often than not, the sins that we participate in are the various things causing us our disease, right? Our gluttony, our lust, our choleric attitudes, and our anger. All these things that cause so much problems for our bodily health have a spiritual component as well. So they're teaching us something really important. And I offer them especially today in that lesson because there are so many Christians who piously think that somehow the dictates of modern medicine and modern science should be ignored or could be ignored. And all you need is faith. Don't worry about coronavirus. All you need is faith. That is not something an unmercenary healer would ever tell you. Okay? They would not tell you something that flies in the face of medical science. They would simply say, do this, but also take care of your soul as well. Make sure your soul is healthy. If your soul is healthy, your body will be more healthy, you'll be better able to withstand all these things. But there's no wisdom in this kind of quasi-pious attitude that we should ignore vaccines, that we should ignore modern medical research, and things like that. That is not the Orthodox tradition. And it's a great disservice to the memory of saints like these saints who gave their lives to a real ministry. The Lord says, you're given talents. You use those talents to bring forth more. You don't bury them in the ground, right? That's the gospel we heard today. The holy and mercenary healers wanted to lead religious and spiritual lives, but they didn't bury their talents as physicians. In fact, it was through their religious lives that they were able to multiply those talents and bring an extraordinary ministry to the world. Every one of us has been given talents, not just medical, maybe scientific, maybe economic and financial, maybe administrative, whatever it is. Look to these saints like this, who lived in the world but looked beyond the world, who lived in the world but showed the kingdom through their ministry, through their careers and their professions. These are very important to us. We don't give the world to Neptune, to the pagan gods, and say that's the world. I don't want anything to do with it. We take it and we transform it, we transfigure it, we bless it, we sanctify it, we make it holy. We fight back against the craziness, and we give it back to God as intended from the beginning of the creation of the world. Christ is among us.